Have you ever heard of a giant pit bull that people feared so much they believed he carried a curse? A dog so misunderstood that even his presence was enough to send shivers down the spines of an entire town? Tonight, on Veil Marks, we bring you the heart-wrenching tale of Cain, a pit bull who was never given a chance, until the night he proved them all wrong. Pit bulls are one of the most misunderstood breeds in the world. Known for their immense strength, loyalty, and intelligence, they are often labeled as dangerous. But is it the dog we should fear, or the humans who shape them? Before we dive into this incredible story, if you believe in second chances, in seeing the truth beyond fear, give this video a like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps Veil Marks grow and bring more meaningful, unforgettable stories to life. This is not just a story about a dog. This is a story about trust, redemption, and the silent battles we all fight. Stay until the end, because the lesson in this tale is one that will stay with you forever. The rain fell in thin, whispering sheets, painting the empty streets with a shimmering silver hue. The town lay silent, save for the occasional rattle of wind against old shutters and the distant howl of a dog, but not Cain. Cain did not howl. He did not bark. He did not make a sound. Instead, he stood beneath the dim glow of a flickering street lamp, his massive frame cloaked in shadow, his sleek black coat glistening under the drizzle. A giant pit bull, built like a war machine, muscles taut beneath his wet fur, broad chest rising and falling in slow, measured breaths. His amber eyes, sharp yet hauntingly solemn, reflected the pale light like molten gold. But there was no warmth in those eyes. He didn't move. He didn't blink. He simply stood there, as if waiting, as if watching. A curtain fluttered across the street as a woman hurriedly pulled it shut, her face tense with unease. A child clutched at her mother's dress, peering through the glass with wide, frightened eyes, her small fingers digging into the fabric as if the dog might lunge through the window at any moment. Somewhere, a door slammed, a sharp, final sound cutting through the damp night air like a warning. "Stay away from that dog!" The words were sharp, urgent, and edged with fear. Cain had heard them too many times before. He had once belonged to people, had once known the warmth of a home, the comfort of belonging. But people feared him now, not because of what he had done, but because of what they believed. The whispers had started long ago. The first owner disappeared without a trace. A man who had lived alone, no family, no close friends. One evening, he had taken Cain out for a walk, and neither of them had returned. Days passed, weeks. The authorities searched, but the man had vanished, leaving nothing behind except the dog. Cain had been found sitting outside the house, waiting, unmoving, his eyes locked on the door as if expecting his owner to return at any moment. The second owner met a terrible fate. A woman in her 30s, known for her cautious nature, was driving home one night when her car veered off the road and slammed into a tree. The impact was fatal. When the paramedics arrived, they found Cain sitting by the wreckage, his head low, his eyes fixed on the twisted metal. Then came the third. A man who had taken Cain in, despite the growing rumors, brushing them off as superstitious nonsense. But one fateful night, his house went up in flames. The fire spread too quickly, consuming everything before help could arrive. The man didn't make it out. The neighbors who witnessed the tragedy swore they saw Cain standing outside, staring into the blaze, his dark silhouette unmoving against the backdrop of destruction, like a grim reaper watching his work unfold. That was the moment the town had made up its mind. Cain wasn't just an unfortunate dog caught in unfortunate circumstances. Cain was cursed. No one knew how it started, whether it was an old tale twisted over time or pure coincidence. But the belief had taken root like an unshakable truth. One by one, the people who had taken him in had met misfortune, and soon no one dared to claim him. Cain became a specter, a walking omen of doom. Children screamed at the sight of him, running to hide behind their parents. Adults crossed the street when they saw him approaching, their gazes filled with revulsion, dread, and something else, pity. Even stray dogs avoided him. It wasn't just humans who sensed it. The fear, the hostility, the invisible wall that separated Cain from the world. Yet Cain never barked, he never lunged, never bared his teeth. He simply watched. Each night he returned to the same places, the homes where he had once lived, the doorsteps where he had once slept. He would sit there for hours, unmoving, his massive body a silent guardian of memories long past. But no doors opened for him. No hands reached out to stroke his head. No soft voices called his name. Cain was alone, a prisoner of a fate he didn't understand. The rain continued to fall, soaking into the earth, running in thin rivulets down Cain's broad back. His ears flicked slightly at the distant sound of footsteps, but he remained still, waiting, hoping. But he already knew how this night would end, just like every other. Alone, beneath the street lamp, a shadow in the darkness, a ghost of what once was, and what would never be again. The town had always whispered about her. From the moment she was old enough to understand the weight of their stares, Eleanor knew she was different. She had been born without a voice, her silence stretching like an invisible chasm between her and the world. As a child, she had tried to keep up with the other kids, to laugh even though she made no sound, to smile even when they taunted her. But the harder she tried to fit in, the more they pushed her away. She became a shadow, existing at the edges of a town that had long since decided she was a bad omen. People called her cursed, just like they called him. Eleanor didn't believe in curses, but she believed in loneliness. She had lived with it for as long as she could remember. She had been no older than 6 when the world had taught her the cruelest lesson of all, that her silence was not just a condition, but a sentence. The night it happened was burned into her memory like a scar that would never fade. A dark alley, a flickering light overhead. A man, tall, broad-shouldered, his face hidden beneath the brim of a hat, standing over another man who lay crumpled on the pavement. She had seen the blade glint before it sank into flesh, had seen the way the man's body jerked once, then stilled. She had wanted to scream. She had opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Not a cry, not a gasp, nothing. She had run home, shaking, her small hands clutching at her chest as if she could force sound from her throat. But the silence had stayed. It had consumed her. And as the days turned into years, she had stopped trying to break it. The town never knew what she had witnessed that night. They only knew that after that evening, Eleanor had stopped trying to speak altogether, and the rumors had begun. She saw something she wasn't supposed to. She was touched by something dark. She's cursed, just like that dog. She learned to ignore the whispers, but no matter how much she willed herself not to care, she was always alone, until she saw him. It was an autumn evening, the sky painted in hues of dusky orange and deep violet. A cold wind whispered through the streets, scattering brittle leaves across the cobblestone. She had been walking home from the small bookshop on the corner, her coat pulled tightly around her, when she first spotted the black shape standing in the rain. Cain. She had heard of him, of course. Everyone in town had. The cursed dog. The beast people feared but never truly understood. He stood motionless beneath the glow of a street lamp, the rain sliding off his thick, muscular frame. His coat, slick and dark as ink, clung to his powerful body. Water dripped from his muzzle, from the tips of his ears, pooling at his massive paws. He made no sound. He did not growl or bare his teeth. He simply watched. Eleanor should have kept walking, should have crossed the street like everyone else did, quickened her pace, averted her gaze. but she didn't. Because in the depths of Cain's golden eyes, she saw something that no one else had ever noticed. Not rage, not danger, not a curse, but a sadness so deep it felt like drowning, a loneliness that mirrored her own. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, two outcasts standing in the rain, caught in a moment of quiet understanding. Then Eleanor did something she had never done before. She stepped closer. The street lamp buzzed faintly above them, flickering as the wind howled through the alley. The rain soaked into her sleeves, chilled her skin, but she didn't care. She took another step. Cain did not move. Another step. Still, he only watched her, his body tense, his massive head tilted slightly as if he couldn't quite understand why she wasn't afraid. Eleanor swallowed. She lifted her hand. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached toward him, palm upturned, her breath catching in her throat. Cain flinched. It was barely noticeable, a slight shift in his posture, the brief flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. No one had ever willingly touched him. No one had ever reached out without fear. Eleanor held still, letting him decide. For what felt like an eternity, Cain hesitated. Then, finally, he moved. Slowly, cautiously, he lowered his massive head, pressing his wet nose against the center of her palm. His fur was damp beneath her fingertips, coarse yet warm. His breath ghosted over her skin, steady and slow. Eleanor exhaled, the tension leaving her shoulders. For the first time in a long, long while, she wasn't afraid, and neither was he. She felt it in the way his body relaxed, in the way his tail gave a slow, hesitant wag. In that quiet, rain-soaked moment, something shifted. A bond formed. Unspoken, unbreakable. Two souls, both abandoned, both misunderstood, had found each other. Cain was not a monster. Eleanor was not a curse. And for the first time in either of their lives, they were not alone. The rain had long since stopped, but the dampness clung to the streets, leaving behind the lingering scent of wet earth and fallen leaves. The town, bathed in the soft glow of early morning light, stirred awake as shopkeepers flipped their signs to open, and the scent of freshly brewed coffee drifted from the cafe on Main Street. Eleanor walked among them, silent as always, her footsteps light against the cobblestone. But she was not alone. At her side, moving with quiet purpose, was Cain. He walked close, his massive frame casting a long shadow beside her, his golden eyes scanning every passing face. He was neither aggressive nor fearful, just watchful, protective. Eleanor could feel the shift in the air whenever someone noticed him. Conversations faltered, eyes darted toward them before quickly looking away, as if avoiding Cain's gaze might keep them safe. The whispers followed them. "She's lost her mind. That dog is cursed. Just wait. Something terrible will happen to her, too." Eleanor ignored them. For the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of walking through town. Cain wasn't just following her. He was guarding her. And yet, not everyone was so quick to accept their companionship. As she turned onto the familiar path leading to her small cottage at the edge of town, a figure stepped into her way. An old woman, wrapped in a faded shawl, her weathered hands clutching a wicker basket. Her eyes, pale and clouded with age, fixed on Cain with an intensity that sent an involuntary shiver down Eleanor's spine. The old woman shook her head. "Child." Her voice was no more than a whisper, the kind that carried more weight than a shouted warning. "Do you not fear the curse?" Eleanor stopped. She met the woman's gaze but said nothing because, of course, she couldn't. The old woman took a cautious step closer, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret meant only for Eleanor's ears. "That beast brings nothing but misfortune," she murmured. "One by one, they all suffered. And now you have welcomed him into your home." The moment stretched long between them. Eleanor could feel the weight of generations of superstition pressing down on her, an invisible force urging her to turn away, to abandon the creature by her side. But then Cain shifted, pressing his head gently against her hand. The warmth of his fur against her fingers grounded her. She didn't need words to know what to do. She smiled, a small, knowing smile, and shook her head. The old woman sighed. "You are either very brave or very foolish." Eleanor only turned and kept walking. Cain followed. By the time they reached her small cottage, the morning had brightened, casting dappled sunlight through the trees. The house was modest but warm, surrounded by a garden overgrown with ivy and wildflowers. It had always felt a little too empty, a little too quiet. But as Cain stepped inside, shaking the dampness from his fur before padding to the center of the room, the place felt different. It felt like home. Eleanor knelt beside him, running her fingers through his thick fur. He leaned into her touch, eyes half-lidded, as if this was the first time in his life he had felt safe enough to rest. That day marked the beginning of something neither of them fully understood. Cain did not leave her side. Each morning he walked with her into town, his presence turning wary glances into cautious stares. When the shopkeeper hesitated before placing her change in her hand, when children pointed from a distance but never dared approach, Cain stood by her, silent and unmoved. And when the whispers turned to sneers, when cruel boys thought it amusing to throw pebbles at the mute girl who had befriended the cursed dog, Cain simply stepped between them and her, unmoving, unyielding, protective. He never growled. He never snapped. He didn't have to. All it took was one look from those golden eyes for the boys to hesitate, their laughter faltering before they scattered like leaves in the wind. Eleanor felt something she hadn't felt in years. Safe. Not just from the town's cruelty, not just from the loneliness that had settled into her bones like an old wound, but from the past, from the night that had stolen her voice, from the fear that had kept her trapped in her own silence. Cain was not a curse. He was a guardian, a protector, a silent promise that no matter how much the world rejected them, they would never be alone again. And Eleanor, for the first time in her life, believed in something other than fear. She believed in him. She believed in them. And as the days passed, as Cain learned the rhythm of her life, as the space beside her bed became his, as the weight of his head against her lap became familiar, Eleanor knew one thing with certainty. Cain had always been meant to find her, just as she had always been meant to save him. The night was quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that wasn't peaceful, but unnatural, like the world was holding its breath. Inside the small cottage at the edge of town, Eleanor lay curled beneath a worn quilt, her breathing steady, lost in the rare comfort of sleep. The old wooden floorboards creaked faintly as the wind pressed against the windows, carrying the soft rustling of leaves from the nearby trees. Cain lay beside her bed, his massive body curled into a protective position, his golden eyes half-lidded but never fully closed. He had always been a light sleeper, always listening, always watching. It was a habit formed from years of uncertainty, from the constant knowledge that the world saw him as something to be feared, something to be hunted. But tonight, something was wrong. His ears flicked, his muscles tensed. Then, a sound, so faint that a human wouldn't have noticed. But Cain did. A shift in the wind, the creak of a floorboard outside the house. His head lifted instantly, eyes sharpening. His breath came out in slow, measured exhales as he listened. There. Another step. Someone was outside. Cain pushed himself to his feet, his massive frame moving soundlessly through the dark. His nose twitched. There was a scent, unfamiliar and wrong, carrying the unmistakable stench of sweat and metal. His hackles rose. Then, the door handle turned. Cain lunged, not at the door, not at the unseen intruder, at Eleanor. His jaws closed around the sleeve of her nightshirt, his powerful teeth clenching the fabric as he yanked her out of bed. Eleanor awoke with a gasp, her body jolting from the force of Cain's pull. Confusion flooded her mind. Cain's grip was firm but careful, not hurting her but insistent. She sat up, trying to shake the sleep from her head, but Cain growled, a low, guttural warning that sent a shiver down her spine. She had never heard him sound like that before. Then, the front door burst open. The wooden frame splintered as it was kicked inward, the door slamming against the wall with a deafening crack. A shadow moved, fast, too fast, as a figure rushed inside. A man. Broad-shouldered, clad in dark clothes. A mask covered the lower half of his face, but his eyes gleamed in the dim candlelight. And in his hand, a knife. The blade glinted as it caught the flickering glow, its sharp edge stained with something dark, something old. Eleanor's breath caught. A deep, primal terror rooted her to the spot. She had seen that kind of blade before, years ago, in the alley, in her nightmares. It was him, the man from that night, the one she had tried to scream for but no sound had come, the man who had stolen not just a life, but her voice, and now he was here, for her. He moved fast, too fast, lunging toward her like a shadow uncoiling, the knife raised. Cain collided with him mid-strike, a blur of black fur and muscle, slamming into the man with the force of a battering ram. The attacker was knocked sideways, the knife slipping from his grip and clattering onto the wooden floor. Cain didn't stop. He didn't hesitate. He was on him in an instant, his teeth sinking deep into the man's forearm. The intruder howled in pain, thrashing beneath Cain's massive weight, his free hand scrambling to reach for the knife. Cain clamped down harder. The man screamed again, but this time there was something else in his voice. Panic. For the first time he was afraid, but he was strong, stronger than Eleanor had expected. With a sharp, desperate motion, he yanked a smaller blade from his belt, one Eleanor hadn't seen, and drove it into Cain's side. The impact was brutal. Cain's body tensed, his growl cutting off into a sharp exhale as the steel buried deep into muscle. Blood bloomed instantly, dark against his black fur, soaking into the wooden floor beneath him. Eleanor felt like she couldn't breathe. Cain didn't let go. Even as pain ripped through him, even as his own blood stained his coat, he held firm, his jaws locked around the man's arm, keeping him pinned. Eleanor's mind screamed at her to move, to do something. She scrambled toward the fallen knife, her fingers closing around the hilt. Her heart pounded in her chest, her pulse deafening in her ears. The man saw her. Even through the pain, through the shock, he knew. And he did what any desperate man would do. He twisted the blade in Cain's side. Cain's body jerked, a choked snarl of pain tearing from his throat. His grip on the attacker's arm loosened, just for a second. A second was all the man needed. He shoved Cain off with a brute force, rolling free. Cain stumbled, his legs trembling beneath him. His breathing was rough, uneven. Blood dripped from the wound, matting his fur, pooling beneath him. But when the man pushed himself up, reaching for his weapon again, Cain moved. Even wounded, even bleeding, he did not stop. With a final, defiant snarl, he launched himself forward, knocking the man back down, slamming him against the floor. And this time, he did not let go. His teeth found the man's throat. The attacker froze. A low, warning growl rumbled deep in Cain's chest, a sound that promised death if the man moved even an inch. For the first time that night, Eleanor saw something change in the intruder's expression. The look of a predator realizing he was no longer the hunter. He was the prey. The front door burst open again, this time with the flashing of red and blue lights. The police. Shouts filled the room, but Eleanor barely heard them. She was already on the floor beside Cain, her hands pressing against the wound in his side. His breath was shallow. His golden eyes found hers. And Eleanor, for the first time in her life, made a sound. A sob. choked, desperate, raw. She could feel the warmth of his blood against her hands. She could feel his body trembling. She could feel her world breaking, because Cain had not been cursed. Cain had saved her, and now she could only hope she wasn't about to lose him. The sound of sirens shattered the silence of the night, red and blue lights flashing across the damp ground, reflecting off shattered glass and blood-stained wood. The chaos of the moment seemed frozen in time, stretched thin between the echo of hurried footsteps and the sharp orders barked by officers spilling into the house. The scene before them was one that demanded an immediate reaction. Cain stood in the center of the dimly lit room, his massive frame tense, his mouth stained with fresh blood, his breath coming in sharp, heavy exhales. His golden eyes, usually calm, flickered in the dim glow of emergency lights, locked onto the lifeless man sprawled across the wooden floor. Eleanor was on her knees beside him, her hands trembling as she pressed against the deep wound in Cain's side. Her nightshirt was soaked in his blood, her fingers slick with it, but she didn't move. She didn't care. The officers didn't hesitate. One of them, a tall man with a hard, angular face, lifted his gun and aimed it directly at Cain's head. "Step away from the girl!" The words barely registered in Eleanor's ears. She was too focused on Cain's labored breathing, the way his muscles twitched with exhaustion. But Cain didn't move. He stood where he was, still between Eleanor and the now lifeless intruder, still protecting her, even as the guns pointed at him instead. "Put the dog down!" another officer barked. Eleanor's heart stopped. "No." She tried to move, but the weight of the moment, the sheer wrongness of it, kept her rooted to the spot. To them, Cain was the monster, a cursed beast, a killer. They didn't see what he had done for her. They didn't see the way he had saved her life, again and again. They only saw the blood. Cain tilted his head, his ears flicking back at the sound of the voices, the sharp clicks of safety triggers being released. But he still didn't move. He didn't snarl. He didn't run. He just stood there. And that was enough. The officer's finger squeezed the trigger. The gun went off. The shot rang through the air, cutting through everything. Eleanor screamed. The moment stretched impossibly long, yet it all happened too fast. Cain jerked back, his massive body collapsing with a heavy thud against the wooden floor. His breath hitched, his golden eyes widening briefly before the strength in them flickered. Eleanor's world shattered. She had never screamed before. Not when she was a child, watching the life drain from a man's body. Not when she was beaten down by whispers, by the weight of a world that refused to hear her. Not when she had spent years being treated as if her silence meant she didn't matter. But now, she screamed, a raw, agonized sound, torn from the very depths of her soul. And for the first time, the town heard her. She threw herself onto Cain, her hands frantically pressing against his wound as if she could force life back into him. "Cain!" She didn't care that the officers were shouting at her. She didn't care that the entire town had gathered outside, watching, whispering. She didn't care about anything, except him. Blood seeped through her fingers, warm and thick, staining her skin, but she didn't move. She wouldn't let go. Cain let out a slow, labored breath, his body trembling beneath her touch. His head lolled slightly, his golden eyes finding hers. The light in them, the warmth, the understanding, the love, was fading. No, no, no. Eleanor's hands shook violently, her vision blurring with tears as she clutched at him. Not him too. She had lost everything once. She would not lose him. Eleanor lifted her tear-streaked face toward the officers, her voice rising with desperation, raw and shaking, but undeniably loud. "He saved me!" she cried. The words startled even her. Her voice, a thing she thought she had lost forever, rang out through the night. She turned to the officers, her hands trembling as she pointed toward the dead man on the floor. He was going to kill me. Cain, he... She gasped, choking on sobs. He protected me. He saved me. For the first time, people were listening. The officer who had fired the shot hesitated, the gun still gripped in his hands. He looked from Eleanor to Cain, then to the man's motionless body on the ground. One of the officers rushed forward, checking the intruder's pulse. His expression shifted almost immediately. "This is..." He looked back at his superior, eyes dark with realization. "This is the guy we've been looking for. The serial killer. The one who..." The tension shifted. A murmur rippled through the crowd that had gathered outside, whispers turning into stunned gasps. The realization was slow, like the unraveling of a long, woven lie. Cain had not been the monster. Cain had saved her, had saved all of them. The weight of the truth settled over the town like an unbearable weight, the decades of superstition and fear unraveling in a single breath. But none of it mattered to Eleanor. None of it would mean anything if Cain, her Cain, didn't survive. She looked down at him, at the shallow rise and fall of his chest, at the way his body trembled against her. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice breaking. She pressed her forehead against his, feeling the warmth of his breath against her skin. "Please." The officers had called for medics. People were rushing around her, but she didn't move, didn't let go. She refused to let go. Cain was not cursed. He was not a monster. He was her hero. And she wasn't going to let the world take him away from her. Not now. Not ever. The weight of the night still lingered, heavy and suffocating, as the officers moved swiftly through the dimly lit house. The flickering red and blue lights from their squad cars cast distorted shadows on the walls, illuminating the carnage that had unfolded just moments before. The once quiet home, which had stood as Eleanor's only refuge, was now a crime scene, buzzing with hurried voices and the shifting of boots against blood-stained wood. Cain lay motionless on the floor, his massive body still, his breathing shallow. Eleanor refused to move from his side, her trembling fingers pressed against the deep wound in his side, her heart hammering against her ribs with each weak exhale from his bloodied muzzle. But outside the house, the world was changing. The real monster had been caught. Two officers wrestled the battered intruder to the ground, his face twisted in fury as his arms were wrenched behind his back and secured with metal cuffs. His breaths were ragged, stained with exhaustion and the sharp sting of failure. He gritted his teeth as one of the officers yanked him to his feet. And then, a sharp intake of breath. One of the detectives, a seasoned officer with graying hair and piercing blue eyes, froze as he caught sight of the man's face. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered, stepping closer, his gaze narrowing in recognition. Another officer turned toward him, confused. "You know him?" The detective didn't answer immediately. His sharp eyes drifted downward, landing on the bloodied knife still clutched in the suspect's hand. The blade was slick, reflecting the dim light in cruel glints. But the detective wasn't looking at the weapon itself. He was looking at the tattoo etched across the man's wrist. A coiled chain, the mark of an underground operation he had once tried to shut down. A memory surfaced, years ago. A man involved in illegal dogfighting rings. A man who had evaded justice, disappearing without a trace. And now, he was standing right in front of them. "Son of a..." The detective let out a low breath, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "That's him." "Who?" one of the younger officers asked. The detective's expression darkened. "The man who used to own that dog." The words hung heavy in the air. The officers looked between the handcuffed suspect and the wounded dog lying inside the house, the pieces of the puzzle snapping into place with horrifying clarity. This wasn't just some random break-in. This was personal. The detective took a slow step forward, his eyes narrowing on the restrained man. You ran the dog-fighting rings out on the outskirts of town, didn't you?" His voice was low, controlled. "Years ago, before you disappeared." The suspect's lip curled, but he said nothing. The detective pressed on. "And you owned a dog," he continued, his gaze flicking back toward Cain. "A big black pit bull." A flicker of something dangerous crossed the man's expression. "And let me guess," the detective added, tilting his head. "He was too loyal." Silence. The kind that spoke louder than words. Eleanor's breath caught. She looked down at Cain, her fingers still pressed against his fur. The dog didn't stir, but even now his presence was steady. Strong. Cain wasn't cursed. He had never been cursed. He had been trying to protect his owners all along. All the past deaths, the tragedies that had been pinned on him, they had never been his fault. It had been this man, the first owner, the one who had vanished without a trace. He hadn't disappeared. He had been hiding in the shadows, waiting. And every time Cain had found a new home, every time he had bonded with someone new, this man had hunted them down one by one, to erase the last trace of what he had abandoned. The townspeople, the whispers, the rumors, they had all gotten it wrong. Cain had never been the bringer of misfortune. He had been the last guardian. The truth settled like a slow-moving storm, dark and heavy. The townspeople who had gathered outside, their faces pale and uneasy, began to understand the depth of their mistake. For years, they had feared the wrong creature. For years, they had turned their backs on an innocent being, blaming him for their own failure to see the truth. The mayor, who had once spoken so loudly about keeping the town safe, now stood in ashamed silence. The butcher, who had thrown rocks to scare Cain away from his shop, clenched his hands into fists, his expression unreadable. Even the children, the ones who had been raised on stories of the cursed dog, watched with wide eyes as if seeing Cain for the first time. A quiet murmur moved through the crowd. And then, a single voice broke through the silence. "I was wrong." The words came from a man in the crowd. One of the shopkeepers, his voice thick with emotion. Another voice followed. "So were we." The tide was shifting. The weight of guilt was settling in. But none of it mattered to Eleanor. Not the crowd. Not their realization. All that mattered was Cain. Her trembling hands clutched at him as she whispered his name. "Stay with me," she pleaded. Cain let out a slow, shuddering breath. His eyes barely opened, but he was still there, still fighting. The detective turned back toward the suspect, his voice cold and unforgiving. "You'll rot in a cell for what you've done." The suspect didn't fight anymore. He had already lost. The past had finally caught up to him. As the officers dragged him away, the crowd parted, their gazes lingering on the injured dog who had suffered far too much for far too long. For the first time, they didn't look at him with fear. They looked at him with guilt, with respect, with understanding. Cain had not been a monster. He had been a hero all along. Eleanor let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She wasn't alone anymore, and neither was Cain. For the first time in his life, he was finally seen. Not as a curse, not as an omen, but as the protector he had always been. And as the medics arrived, kneeling beside Eleanor to tend to Cain's wounds, she whispered softly, just for him, "You're going to be okay." Because for the first time in both of their lives, they finally had a future. Together. The night stretched long and heavy, the weight of it pressing down on Eleanor as she sat on the cold wooden floor, cradling Cain against her. His body was massive, yet he felt fragile in her arms, his warmth fading beneath the steady trickle of blood that seeped from his wound. She had never felt so helpless. Her hands pressed firmly against his side, but the bleeding wouldn't stop. Cain's breaths were shallow, labored, his chest rising and falling in weak, uneven intervals. His once powerful frame, the very presence that had terrified the town for years, now lay still, vulnerable. Eleanor could feel her own breath hitching in her throat, the sharp sting of tears burning in her eyes. She had always been silent, always endured pain in quiet solitude. But this was unbearable. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking, barely more than a breath against the dark. She would not lose him, not after everything. Not after he had fought for her, bled for her, protected her when no one else had. Her fingers curled into his fur, her body trembling as she held on to him like he was the only thing anchoring her to the world. And maybe he was. The town had gathered outside, their whispers hushed now, no longer filled with fear or contempt. They had seen the truth unfold before their eyes, had watched as Cain, the so-called cursed dog, stood between Eleanor and death itself. For the first time, they didn't see him as a monster. For the first time, they saw him as he truly was. A protector, a hero. But none of that mattered if he didn't survive. The hours dragged on, the night shifting into a restless, uneasy silence. The medics had done what they could, stitching the wound and stopping the worst of the bleeding, but their voices had been uncertain, their faces clouded with doubt. "He's strong," one had murmured. "If he makes it through the night, he might have a chance." A chance. It wasn't enough. Eleanor didn't sleep. She sat beside Cain the entire time, her fingers never leaving his fur, her heartbeat syncing with the slow, steady rhythm of his breath. She refused to close her eyes, refused to let him wake up alone. The world outside began to shift, darkness retreating as the first hints of dawn stretched across the sky. The golden light crept through the broken window, spilling across the floor in soft streaks of warmth. And then, a slow inhale, a flicker of movement beneath her touch. Eleanor's heart stopped. She held her breath as Cain's massive frame shifted ever so slightly, his body tensing before a faint, exhausted whimper escaped his throat. And then, his eyes, those golden eyes. Faintly, weakly, they opened. Eleanor let out a choked gasp, her vision blurring with fresh tears. "Cain." His gaze found hers, tired but still there, still fighting. He was alive. A quiet sob shook her shoulders as she bent forward, pressing her forehead against his. Her fingers curled against his fur, relief flooding through her like a tidal wave. She had almost lost him, but he had stayed, like he always had. The soft sound of footsteps on gravel pulled Eleanor's attention. She turned slightly, her tear-filled eyes widening as she took in the sight before her. A small child, no older than 7, stood a few feet away, his tiny hands clenched at his sides. His gaze was locked onto Cain, but unlike before, there was no fear in his eyes. Hesitant, uncertain, he took a single step forward, and then another. The townspeople watched, their expressions unreadable as the little boy slowly knelt beside Cain. His small fingers trembled as he reached out, pressing his tiny hand against Cain's scarred head. For years, the children of this town had run from him, had screamed at the sight of him. But now, here was one, touching him, accepting him. Cain didn't flinch, didn't pull away. He simply lay still, his golden eyes watching the boy with quiet curiosity. And then, a slow, tired wag of his tail. The child let out a soft giggle, his fear melting away. Eleanor swallowed against the lump in her throat as she looked up, her gaze sweeping across the faces of the townspeople. They weren't whispering anymore. They weren't looking at Cain with fear or disgust. They were looking at him with something different, something closer to awe, closer to understanding. The mayor, who had once demanded that Cain be put down, now stood in silent contemplation. The butcher, the one who had chased Cain away with stones, lowered his head as if ashamed. They had all been so wrong. Cain had never been a curse. He had been a guardian, A quiet protector in the shadows, never asking for anything in return. And now, finally, he was seen. Not as a monster, not as an omen, but as the hero he had always been. A silent warrior who had endured years of pain, rejection, and solitude, only to save the very people who had turned their backs on him. The crowd began to disperse, but something had shifted. This town would never be the same again, and neither would Eleanor. She looked back down at Cain, her fingers stroking gently over his fur. He was exhausted, but there was something calm in his expression, something lighter. For the first time in his life, he had a home that would never turn him away, a place where he belonged. And as the sun rose higher in the sky, casting warm light over the two of them, Eleanor knew the truth with absolute certainty. Cain had always been more than just a dog. He was her family, her protector, her silent hero. And no matter what, she would never let him be alone again. Because love, real, unconditional love, healed even the deepest wounds. As the sun rose that morning, Cain, a dog who had once been feared and shunned, finally opened his eyes to a world that saw him differently. No longer a monster, no longer cursed. He had bled for them, he had suffered for them, and in the end, he had saved them. Eleanor sat by his side, her hand resting on his massive frame, her heart still racing with the fear of almost losing him. The town, once filled with whispers of superstition, now stood in quiet realization. They had been wrong. Cain had never been a curse. He had always been a guardian, the only one who had seen the truth when no one else would. There's a saying by Mahatma Gandhi, "The greatness of a nation and its moral progress can be judged by the way its animals are treated." How often do we judge others, human or animal, without truly understanding them? How many times have we believed in lies instead of looking for the truth ourselves? This story is not just about Cain. It's about all of us. About how easy it is to fear what we don't understand. About the power of redemption, of love, of second chances. So now I ask you, have you ever misjudged someone, only to later realize you were wrong? If you have, you're not alone. But the real question is, what will you do differently next time? If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it made you feel, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Veil Marks. Every bit of support helps bring more powerful stories like this to life. Thank you for watching, and remember, not all heroes wear capes. Some walk on 4 legs.